I'm now going to pass you over to Alison Goulter, who's going to give you the talk now on the historical tour of North Norfolk.
Well, first of all, my talk isn't going to be an in-depth study of any one place in North Norfolk, but it seemed to me that during lockdown, a lot of people hadn't had a chance to get away, and the Historical Society had to cancel their outing. So I thought we'd have an imaginary or virtual tour of some place of historical interest in North Norfolk. The talk, I don't know if you can see my pointer, is basically going to follow the coastline round from Hunstanton, visiting various places along the way, as far as Chroma over here, and only places that are about 5 miles inland from the coast will be included. And by its very nature, I've been extremely selective. So I've tried to include places that I've been to that interest me and that cover a wide range of different historical periods. But there won't be an in-depth information on any one place. So imagine that you are climbing aboard the coast off a bus, or getting on a coach or in a car, or even walking along the North Norfolk coast path, and we'll start at the furthest west point at Hunstanton. There's a slightly larger map. And we're going to visit Hunstanton first, then come round the coast to Holme, which is here, and then travel quite a way until we get to the Holcomb estate, which is here, as a beginning. I should perhaps say that the maps are rather old because they're from the National Library of Scotland and were non-copyright, so that's why I've used those. Hunstanton, or to be precise, New Hunstanton, is what I'm going to be concentrating on, because Old Hunstanton is a village that's been in existence for a long time, slightly inland from the coast. And the Lestrange family, who live at Hunstanton Hall, have done so since the 14th century. The first Lestrange recorded was Sir Hammond Lestrange in 1317. Probably he was the first Lestrange member to live at Hunstanton. And in 1846, Sir Henry Lestrange, who was then Lord of the Manor, decided to build New Hunstanton as a select holiday resort. Initially, it was intended to be called Hunstanton St Edmunds, but later it just became known as Hunstanton. The hotels and villas that were grouped around a triangular green, you can see part of it here, were quite large and built of the local carstone, which is a type of sandstone. And most of the buildings were designed by the architect Sir William Butterfield. This is a statue of Sir Henry Lestrange, and the building was continued by his son Hammond. With the arrival of the railway in 1862, this encouraged more expansion and popularity of Hunstanton, and many large hotels grew up. If we walk a short distance up the coast, still in Hunstanton, we come to the remains of St Edmund's Chapel. It's a 13th century, or was a 13th century chapel, and it was built on the site where Edmund, King of the East Angles, arrived from a return trip from Germany in 855 AD. As you probably know, he was later taken prisoner by the Danes at the Battle of Thetford and was martyred and buried at Bury St Edmunds. And the monks from Bury St Edmunds erected the chapel here in his memory, which stood for 400 years. Seems to have missed out a slide. Sorry, I'm going back one. Right, Holme next to sea, just around the corner of the coast. Unfortunately, I don't actually have a picture to hand of the Peddar's Way, but the Peddar's Way is a Roman road stretching all the way from just outside Thetford in a more or less completely straight line up to Holme on the coast. and it was built shortly after AD 61, and was one of the earliest Roman roads to be built in Norfolk. Probably it was initially used for military patrols and also as a supply route to the coastal walls. The actual name Peddars isn't a Roman name, and it's not exclusive to this road. It's probably a name that was given to it in medieval times. The beach at Holme, as much of the coast along this particular stretch along the North Norfolk coast, is a wide expanse of sand. And in the late 1990s, again, sadly, I don't have a picture, the very unusual structure known as, or became known as Sea Henge, was discovered. If you can imagine a circle of 55 timber posts surrounding a central upturned tree stump and dating back to 2049 BC, it was quite an amazing discovery. And there was a lot of controversy at the time as to whether or not it should be left where it was, or whether it should be removed, excavated and removed for preservation. Eventually, the people who wanted to conserve it won, and it was taken to Flag Fen and then to Portsmouth for conservation, and you can now see parts of it in the Kingsland Museum. A second, smaller timber circle was then found nearby, which is dated to even earlier at 2400 BC, and that has remained in situ. So now we're moving on a great deal further around the coast to the Holcomb Hall and its estate. The building itself that you can see here was begun in 1734 by Thomas Cook, 1st Earl of Leicester, and it was designed by his friends William Kent and Robert, the 3rd Earl of Burlington, and turned into working drawings by a Norwich architect called Matthew Brettingham. It was intended, and was used as such, to house all the treasures that the Earl had brought back from his grand tour. And so although the outside looks quite austere, especially as it was built in yellow brick rather than stone, the inside is anything but. It's very opulent with many carving, sculptures and paintings and so on. Initially, visitors were intended to enter the estate via the Triumphal Arch, which is some way to the south. Here's the Triumphal Arch. It comes down here, the driveway crosses a lane now, and then it continues all the way down here, past the memorial to the late Thomas Cook, who I'll mention in a minute, and this column here, where you eventually get a magnificent view of the house below you and the lake beyond. There's a beautiful avenue, as you can see, of ilex oaks that have been planted on either side. In the 1840s, this approach was changed because most people were accessing the hall via the coast road, which was to the north. So the Triumphal Arch, in a sense, became a bit redundant, and you don't get the same impression when you approach it from the coast as previously. At that time, some almshouses were built on the coast road. These are the almshouses, and also some new gates to the park. This map gives you some idea of the extent of the park. You can see basically the belt of trees mark the outline of it. It's about 9 miles round, and the great nephew of the original builder, Thomas Cook, who lived from 1754 to 1842 and became the famous Cook of Norfolk that many of us learned about in our history lessons at school. He was particularly interested in farming techniques. He encouraged the breeding of new breeds of animals to be more efficient. He had a sheep shearing competition taking place on the estate every year where people could share ideas, and he introduced the Norfolk four-course crop rotation system. He was also responsible for planting 50 acres of trees every year around the 9 miles of park edge until it was completed with about 1 million trees in total. The landscape for the hall was originally designed by Capability Brown in 1762, but then Repton later modified it and enlarged the lake to the serpentine shape that you can see today, and generally changed things around a bit. Now we move on within this to think about deserted villages, which interests me. Just to the north of where the hall is now, well, about where the hall is, there were 2 manor houses and the original village of Holcomb. But with the creation of the park, they were demolished, and when the lake was enlarged, the final ones were demolished, and people were moved to Holcomb, mostly to the new settlement of Holcomb down by the coast road, which used to just be a small stave. So lots of deserted villages in Norfolk can be attributed to a variety of things. This one, along with others, was due to emparkment, where a park has been created and the houses of the villagers have had to be moved. Another example, not very far away, of a deserted village is Egmia. The word, or the name Egmia, is Old English for Ector's Pond, and historians think that there may have been a pre-Roman settlement there. It's located in between the creeks and the waterlands, and so the creeks are over on this side, the waterlands are over here, and the village of Egmia was just here where it says church. There is a farm a little way away and a few cottages which still exist today, but the actual village site here, apart from the church and some mounds, is largely deserted. And there were 2 other deserted settlements in the vicinity. Quarles up here, you can see there was a remainder of a church there, and Waterden down here again, which still does have its churches, but that's about all that's left. This is the church that is remaining at Egmia, and the humps and bumps around mark the platforms where the houses were, and the holloways, and there are more going off to the left here, show you where the roads and so on were in the past. It's not really clear why the village became deserted. It was still going strong in the 14th century after the Black Death. In fact, they financed a new church tower after the Black Death, but the soil in this area is quite light and unproductive, so maybe the villagers just drifted away to the larger villages in the valleys on either side. We do know that in 1428 it was excused parish tax as there were less than 10 households living there. And in 1553 to 58, the parson Thomas Hatcher complained to the Chancery Court in London that his predecessor had pulled down part of the church, taken the lead from the roof, and sent it and the biggest bell to the coast for export. The church was finally desecrated by Sir Nicholas Bacon, Lord Keeper of the Seal under Elizabeth I and Lord of the Manor, and turned into a barn in 1602. So probably only a very tiny part of the village survived the 16th century. Not very far away from Egmia, travelling in an easterly direction, we come to a much older historical society of Warren Camp, an Iron Age hill fort. It's south of the 2 Warrens now. It's just here where you can see a kind of circular mark on the map, and it's accessed along a short footpath from the lane. This is an aerial photo that was taken of it, which I photographed from the notice board at the entrance. And you can see that most of it is still largely intact. It had 2 banks and 2 ditches. This part has just been clipped by the river, which was realigned earlier on in the 18th century. It doesn't look terribly impressive in this picture, but this is approaching it, and this is the outer bank, the ditches in advance, in front of it. But it really is a huge site. This is the part of the inside of the hill fort. This is one of the kind of dips of the entrance ways. And that gives you some idea of how deep the main inner ditch is. So it really is quite impressive. In the adjoining field is Warren Burrows, which is a large low-time enclosure which you can only see from the air, and it's considered that that might be a ceremonial site associated with this Iron Age camp. Moving on to Binham, travelling eastwards, both the village and the priory are well worth a visit. Again, Binham itself is on the south side of a tributary of the Stupy River, and the priory is just to the northwest of what is now the main centre of the village. Peter, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this properly, Peter de Valois, who was nephew of William the Conqueror, owned the manor in Binham, and it was he who founded the Benedictine priory here in 1088. He then gave the manor to the prior in 1091 as income. The priory is dedicated to St Mary, at least the priory itself was, and the church, because the villagers always used the nave as their parish church, was dedicated to the Holy Cross. So it's now dedicated to St Mary and the Holy Cross. The great east window, which is, west window, which is here, which sadly doesn't look very stunning at the moment because it's been bricked up since the 1800s to stabilise it. But it is one of the earliest examples of what is known as bar tracery. It's actually older in Westminster Abbey. And if you can imagine that these roundels, and there was another one here, would have been as decorative as the one at the top, and then the individual sections would have been divided into 4, it really was quite stunning. You can also see that there were originally side aisles on both sides, neither of which have survived. This is a detail of the west front, and again, it's a really good example of early English architecture. It was built between 1226 and 1244, and the whole priory is built of local flint and also Barnett limestone, which would have been brought from Northamptonshire by river and brought up the river, by sea and river, and brought up on barges to the site. Today, it seems very odd and foreshortened because the nave, as I said, was trained as the parish church. So the whole of the east end and the transepts on either side are now outside the building, and this east wall has been put in to create the end of the church. Outside, there are very extensive priory ruins. Here's the cloister over on the right-hand side, and there are also many of the monks' rooms, dwellings, refectories, etc., which you can walk around and visit. You can also see quite clearly the arches of the old windows prior to these new square ones being put in, and also here and up in the clear story as well. Again, not a very clear map, but here is the actual church as it exists today in this slightly darker shaded area. All the other areas marked in red are the remains which are visible above ground. There's also a gatehouse which you can drive through to get to where you're allowed to park, and some extensive meadowland outside on the sites of several fish ponds as well. The village of Binham has a village green. It's not enormous, but was a great deal larger than it is today. But houses have encroached on part of it, and it was quite important. It was granted a charter in 1107 to hold a yearly fair for 4 days in July, and also a weekly Wednesday market. The cross here, which has lost its actual cross at the top, is a 15th century, some say market cross, some say preaching cross. The buildings around it are quite grand, some of them. There's a close-up of that one on the next slide. This is a 17th century building. You can also see a building to the left which has a Dutch gable, which is quite common in this area, and shows the links, many links with the Low Countries. And in many cottages, you can find evidence of stone from the priory, which was dissolved in 1540, being reused as building material. Moving on a bit further along the coast, we come to Blakeney. Blakeney is a village shown here. I'm also going to visit Whitten, which is slightly more inland now here, Clyde and Salthouse. And they are all really tied up together because the coastline, which ends in this very impressive Blakeney Spit, has moved considerably. I'll say more about that later. But Blakeney itself was once a very thriving port on the Glaven estuary. This is the River Glaven coming down here in between Whitten and Clyde, and moving out into the Clyde Channel and eventually getting out to the sea. In Domesday Book, Blakeney is described as Esnutrele, E-S-N-U-T-E-R-L-E. That later became known as Snitterley, and it probably referred to the inland part of Blakeney up on the coast road where the church was. And this area was granted a weekly market in 1223. The name Blakeney first appears in a 1340 document, and both names were used up until the 16th century. So it may be that Blakeney referred more to the port area, possibly meaning Black Island, and the Snitterley name referred to the village slightly inland. Blakeney Church was consecrated in 1321 and had 18 Carmelite or white friars based in the priory there. It was largely rebuilt in 1434, and you can see there are pretty impressive long rows of perpendicular windows on both aisles and in the clear story. And the tower, which is over 100 foot tall, really stands out as a landmark for miles around. Friars also built a small chapel at the side of the estuary, designed to bless boats on their way out to sea to give them safe passage, and also to receive donations when they returned. The chancel which you can see at the end, but not very clearly here, it's a lower, much lower roof, is actually a very good example of early English architecture. Very often, the chancels, which were the responsibility of the priest, were not rebuilt when the nave was perhaps enlarged or made grander. Up on the roof, you can just about see them here, is an angel hammer beam roof. This is a close-up of one of the angels on the hammer beam roof. And there are some ornately carved misericords as well. At the opposite end of the church to the main tower, there's another little tower, which was built in the 15th century as a staircase leading up to a chamber, which was over the chancel, but it's also been used for a long time as a beacon for guiding lights into the harbour. There's a light in it. Sorry, guiding boats into the harbour. Blakeney itself, this is the high street, this is running down to the coast, has a lot of fishermen's and small flint cottages, as well as merchants' houses. And running off either side of the street are a number of side yards, as they're known, which have got other houses in as well. It's now an incredibly popular place for tourists to go to, but a far-seeing person in 1946 formed the Blakeney Neighbourhood Housing Association, a person by the name of Nora Crogston, and she saved a group of condemned cottages, and today the Housing Association owns 41 cottages which are rented out to local people, which is just as well, because otherwise they tend to get snapped up by people visiting. Down on the, very close to the harbour, is the Guildhall, which is now under the care of English Heritage. It's actually a mid-14th century brick-vaulted undercroft, possibly of a merchant's house, which was probably used for storage of goods. On the quay, you can see some 18th century granary buildings, and Blakeney was an incredibly important port in the past for trade. Its saltfish was famous in the Middle Ages. It supplied the royal family. In the 16th century, ships were fishing in Icelandic waters and exported grain to the Low Countries and coal from Newcastle. And in the 1800s, packet ships travelled to London. This is now down by the quay itself, and the problems that Blakeney encountered were with the silting up of the channel, and therefore boats, even smaller boats, were finding it a struggle to get in to the quay to unload. They did try reopening a new channel or redirecting it in 1817 to allow larger ships in, which worked for a time, but then of course ships started to get bigger, and in addition, plans to build a railway to Blakeney never materialised. It wasn't economical, and so merchants no longer wanted to transport corn to export from there. So the last vessel to trade abroad from Blakeney was the Janey in 1889, which brought in timber from Gothenburg. By the 20th century, it had changed into very much a popular place for tourists, and the Blakeney Hotel was built in 1923. Now, Whitten, which is here, Clyde and Salthouse, in order to understand these and Blakeney, we need to understand a little bit about what's been happening to the coastline over the course of centuries. I mentioned earlier this Shingle Spit, and the process of longshore drift along the coast naturally carries material from west from east to west along the line of the spit, and the result is that the spit has gradually been getting longer. So whereas several hundred years ago the end of the spit was somewhere around about Clyde Eye, it's now a great deal further along, which meant inevitably that the land behind it was going to start silting up naturally. In addition, the bar is actually moving inland, so the gap between the spit and what was a coastline, which basically followed the coast road, is getting smaller. On top of that, over the centuries, efforts have been made to drain these marshes in order to use them for agriculture. And embanking and draining began as early as 1522, when Sir John Hagan started to drain the marshes at Salthouse and Clyde. And then in 1630, a Dutchman named Van Hassedunk began enclosing the marshes at Salthouse, and Sir Henry Calthorpe and his son Philip did the same for Blakeney marshes. So this is Whitten Church, and it once overlooked a wide channel between there and Clyde on the other side of the valley. It's now a mile between the two, certainly half a mile. Below the church, presumably this house, well, the house certainly wouldn't have been here then, there were iron moorings for the ships, which were still visible in the wall below the church until apparently the 1953 floods. And in 1580, Clyde and Whitten both had, together had 6 ships, which were over 100 tons, whereas Blakeney only had 1 over 100 tons. So you can see just how important they were as ports. Just down the hill from Whitten Church is Whitten Bridge, very old bridge. That was the best picture I could get of it. There was a stone bridge in Whitten from 1292, and having crossed the stone bridge, you then had to follow a causeway across the Gladen Valley over a wooden bridge on the other side of Clyde in order to cross the valley. The ancient wooden causeway piles were visible after the 1953 floods. Trade stopped in Whitten for boats fairly abruptly in 1637 after the Calthorpes built a bank to start draining the marshes, and although they were ordered to remove it a year later, by then damage to the trade had been done and it concentrated more on at Clyde on the other side of the valley. This is Clyde Church, and its size, even though one part of the transept now is ruined, is an indication of the wealth that was in Clyde at the time that it was built. The tower is from an earlier church and was left and not added to, probably because of the arrival of the Black Death. But before that, the chancel had been rebuilt in the 13th century, and the nave was rebuilt during the 14th century in various phases. The windows are particularly, in the clerestory, are particularly beautiful, I think. The porch, which is quite magnificent as well, was built in the 15th century, and it has an upper room in it. You can see the windows here, which would probably have been used for a chancery priest. Inside, you can see the lower roof here of the chancel and the poppy heads in some of the pews. There's some beautifully carved stone corbels as well. This is just one example of them. The church itself, which is on Newgate Green, which is a little way inland from the coast, is now some distance from the main centre of the village, which is largely due to the fact that in 1612 there was a fire which destroyed 117 houses. After that, instead of rebuilding at the same place, the village centre tended to move down towards the coast where the water was deeper. Newgate Green itself was granted a weekly market and an annual fair in 1253. Perhaps one of the most photographed parts of Clyde is the Windmill, and it's a Grade 2 listed building. It was built as a corn mill in the 19th century at the beginning, and it was in operation until 1920. It's now used as a private home and a B&B. Looking across the marshes, so with the sea behind me, you can see Clyde stretched out here, the Windmill, and part of the area that was reclaimed as a result of the draining of the marshes. The coast road from Clyde to Salthouse marks the line of the old coast, and it's slightly raised above the road level. You can see here that the houses are just that bit higher than the road. That's perhaps a slightly better illustration of the fact that this is the old coastline here. And then moving a little further on, we come to Salthouse. Again, looking across the marshes and the church on a slight rise of land at the back of the village. The main Salthouse channel before this was drained, so from sort of where this picture's taken towards the village, was as wide as the Thames is at London Bridge today. So that gives some idea of how it's changed. But the marshes, after they were drained in 1649, ruined Salthouse as a port. The name Salthouse comes from the fact that salt was produced here, and Foe in 1784 wrote, "From Weyburn west lies Clyde, where there are large salt works and very good salt made, which is sold all over the county and sometimes to Holland and the Baltic." St Nicholas Church in Clyde was built between 1497 and 1503, apart from the tower, which again is from an earlier church and dates from the 13th century. The windows facing the sea, as you can just see between the roofs of the houses here, are actually quite narrow, and narrower than they might normally be in this style of architecture. And that's been built deliberately like that to enable them to withstand the force of the gales that happen along the Norfolk coast from time to time. That's the interior of the church, the nave of the church. And in the choir stalls, there's some very old graffiti. I hope you can see that clearly enough, but this is a drawing or scratch marks of a ship, sailing ship. There's another one over here, which were made just as a reminder, really, for us today now, of how important it was as a trading port in those days. The Shingle Ridge, this is the part of the Shingle Ridge, which runs along the coast, all the way from Weybourne to the end of Whitten Spit, is nowhere near as high now as it was a few years ago. It used to be bulldozed up regularly to try and defend the marshes behind, but that's been stopped now, and managed retreat, as it's known, is allowed to take place along the coast. So, going back to our map, we visited Blakeney, Whitten, Clyde and Salthouse, and we're now going to travel further along until we get to Sheringham Park, whoops, there, near Upper Sheringham, and then visit Sheringham briefly and Beeston Regis and the coast along here before coming inland to Felbrigg and ending up at Chroma. Sheringham Park is now owned by the National Trust. The house is not open to the public, but the grounds, the parkland is, and it was bought by Abbot Upshur in 1811, He was very much a local benefactor. Various lifeboats are named after members of the Upshur families in Sheringham. He bought it, the person who arranged the sale was William Repton of Aylsham, and it was his son, Humphrey Repton, who was employed to create the landscape and the new house. There was a farmhouse, there is a farmhouse on the estate as well. The house may have been designed by his Humphrey Repton's son, Adley, and it's built of gilt brick in an Italianate style. Humphrey Repton wrote to Upshur, Sheringham possesses more natural beauty and local advantages than any place I have ever seen. And the park was very much seen as Repton's masterpiece. The Red Book, and he's famous for his red books that he produced to show people what his intentions were with changing the landscape, is now in the RIBA library. So there's some beautiful parkland and glimpses of the sea, sea's over here, in between various plantings. And it's an extremely popular place to visit. Subsequent to Repton's design, many different rhododendrons have been planted, and the view of them at the time when they're mostly out, although they flower for a very long period of time, some are very early, is quite stunning. The main settlement of Sheringham was actually at Upper Sheringham, and there wasn't much in the way of a settlement down by the coast at all. This is Beach Road, and there are, you can see, one or two fishermen's cottages, but mostly the lower Sheringham settlement was at a place called New Hyde, which is a bit further along the coast to the west, where the cliffs dip down and there's easy access to the sea. However, in 1887, the Midland and Great Northern Joint Railway came to Sheringham, and it was then that the town of Sheringham really developed. Several large hotels three were built. This large building here was the Burlington Hotel. It's not now, it's being converted into flats. But the town grew up, as you can see, in the kind of dip in the lie of the land. Down by the coast, we have Fisherman's Slope, and the town still has 4 of its original lifeboats, 3 in the Moe Museum, you can see the top of it there, and one in, I think I'm right in saying one, might be 2 actually, in the sheds at the top of the slope. I'm not going to say a great deal about the history of Sheringham because there's loads you could say about it, but I am just going to highlight one small thing that isn't very often visible, and that's the wreck of the Espalin, which was a German-built 216-ton ship carrying ice from Norway on its way to Gravesend, which was driven ashore in a fierce gale on the 23rd of January, or some say the 29th, in 1897. The Henry Ramey Upshur lifeboat, which was a rowed lifeboat, managed in very heavy seas to rescue all 8 crew. That's a close-up of it, and it's very often, well, mostly, not visible because it's covered by sand. There were some really bad storms in December 2013, and people thought that it had actually been lost for good, but it did reappear again in 2014, so the base of it is still there. To the east of Sheringham, Beeston Farm, as it's now known, or Beeston Hill as it was called, is a very good lookout point. And during the Second World War, it had what was known as a Y station, which is short for Wireless Intercept Station, based on the top of it. You can still see the octagonal concrete base. It was in the form of a tower, and there's an information board at the top of the bump. It was manned by mostly German-speaking Wrens who intercepted radio messages from enemy boats who were out in the sea, North Sea, and they were then able to find their position by locating and referring to Trimmingham and Hemsby, and the information was passed back by phone to Harwich or Chatham, so that Royal Navy coastal forces could launch torpedo boats and gunboats in order to intercept them. They also intercepted coded messages and sent them to Bletchley Park. Just tucked down between the coastline and the coast road, just to the east of Beeston Bump and Sheringham, is Beeston Priory ruins, which perhaps many people don't know, other than obviously people who know the area well, are there. You have to walk along a footpath to get there. Here you can see the remains of one of the fish ponds, and the priory was founded in 1216 by Margaret de Cressy, or possibly her daughter-in-law Isabel de Rye. It was an Augustinian priory of the Order of Peterstone, which is currently a local foundation, and it was dedicated to St Mary. It was quite a small priory. It consisted mostly of 4 or 5 canons, whose role was to serve local parishes as parish priests, and it provided accommodation for travellers, which provided them with part of their income. It also housed farm workers and servants, and in 1535 there were 6 boys boarding at the school. It was dissolved by Henry VIII, as all monasteries were, but the buildings have probably been preserved as well as they have, because in all likelihood they were used as farm buildings. And to the right of this picture today is the Abbey Farmhouse, which was probably the prior's lodgings, and in between those, in their garden, are the remains of the cloisters. But the whole footprint of the abbey is much larger than the current ruins. The Abbey Farmhouse and ruins were in a very bad state of repair, apparently, until they were bought by Norfolk County Council in 1983, when the house was restored and the ruins stabilised and cleared of overgrowth. Going way, way, way back in history, I thought I should mention the Deep History Post. This is a fairly new name that's been given to it. And it runs all the way from Weybourne, this is moving back a little west along the coast, where the cliffs begin and the Shingle Spit ends, and round as far as Hasbro and Carp Gap in the east, which is further than we're travelling today. All that section is made up of fairly soft cliff deposits, the top being from glacial deposits from the last ice age, and it's very much an eroding coast. This is at West Drunton, looking westwards back towards Sheringham, and in the pre-Ice Age period, the land between here and the continent was not actually under the sea. It's been called Doggerland, and it was a large plain with grazing bison, deer, and mammoth on it, and it was only flooded when the sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, somewhere between 10,000 and 8,500 years ago. At the bottom of the cliff at West Drunton are what are known as the fossil beds, and in 1990, a very large bone was found sticking out of the cliff, and on investigation and excavation in 1995, 85% of the skeleton of what was known initially as the West Drunton elephant was uncovered. It's actually the most complete type of this type of mammoth, skeleton of this type of mammoth found anywhere in the world, and dates to somewhere between 720 and 650,000 years ago. In fact, this whole area has the most amazing fossils found in it and evidence of very, very early human activity. This is the cliffs looking in the other direction towards Chroma Pier that you can see. And moving much further around the coast, if you continue beyond Chroma, you come to Hasbro. And at Hasbro, in 2000, a hand axe was found, and excavations in 2005 and 2010 revealed more flint tools dating to 950,000 years ago, which means that we now have evidence that people were living in Britain 200,000 years earlier than we previously knew, and this is the oldest known location in the whole of Northwest Europe. They also found in 2013 some footprints which had been created in the mudflats as a family walked alongside the mudflats 850 to 900,000 years ago, and that's the earliest evidence of humans outside of Africa. Moving back to slightly more recent times, we come to Felberg Hall, which is now owned by the National Trust. The estate was in existence before 1066 and enlarged by the Felbrigg family, and the earliest record of that family is in the 11th century. There are brasses in the church to Sir Simon Felbrigg and his wife Alice, dated 1351, and the house was remained in that family until the mid 15th century, when they were sold to the Windmill family. In 1621 to 24, Sir John Wyndham and his son Thomas built the south front, as you can see it today, onto an existing Tudor building. The west wing, which is on this side, on the left-hand side, was built in the 1680s, and the orangery, which is out of shot in the picture to the left, in 1707. It's a beautiful house, and it also has really lovely grounds. To the east of the house itself is the walled garden with a lovely dovecot which dates to the early 1750s. That's another view of the garden with the dovecot with some greenhouses, and the estate around the area, which is well wooded and also has parkland and a lake, covers 520 acres. And so finally we get to Chroma. Until the Middle Ages, there was another settlement called Shipton-juxta-Mare, which was on the coast, and Chroma itself was some way inland. Unfortunately, with the ravages of the sea, Shipton disappeared beneath the waves, and the church remains now lie about 400 yards offshore and still can be a danger to shipping. Chroma began to become fashionable in the 1790s when the wealthy realised that going to the coast was getting the advantage of the sea and the fresh air was good for them, started to come to the area. And then in 1887, Chroma Beach Station was opened. There was a railway station a bit before that, but further inland, and that made access to the coast much more easy, and it became a popular holiday resort. And Chroma Pier was opened in 1901. It's 450 feet long, and right at the end is the lifeboat station. At the top of the cliff above the pier is one of the remaining very large hotels, the grand hotels that was built in Chroma. This is the Hotel de Parish, and it was built in 1895. In the late 19th century, Clement Scott wrote about Poppyland, which was this area here in Overstrand of North Norfolk, and captured people's imaginations very much, and that really encouraged visitors to come to the area. Chroma Parish Church, which is 15th century, has the tallest tower in Norfolk, which is 160 feet high and really stands out. That's the inside of the church, the nave and the chancel. And now we come to the end. I thought we'd have a beginnings of sunset over the sea at Sheringham to finish up with. And that's just a list of tips and things that I've used to do my research. Thank you very much.
Alison, absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Interestingly enough, when you mentioned Blakeney, I'm actually going to Blakeney next weekend, and I want to see the church. So it's the first church I've ever seen that's got its own lighthouse.
Yes.
So that will certainly be of interest. So I'd like to now ask anybody out there that have got any questions via our chat. I don't think there are many people out there. I do apologise if the sound hasn't come through as well as what can be expected, but it is all down to, of course, the internet. I don't know whether any committee members might have a question. If not, what I'd like to do is once again thank Alison for that, and also for the research that you've done. Very interesting, fascinating to have a talk in an area of Britain that I certainly have never been to before. So I'm looking forward to that next weekend. I'd like to thank at this time those people that have joined us via Eventbrite for taking part in this talk today. We will be back next month with our next talk, but now we're going to hand over.
Harry, there is one question.
Oh, there is there? Oh, that's good. Okay.
Paul James, the ship graffiti looks Elizabethan with 4.5 castles. Is it dated to any particular period?
I think that's probably fairly accurate. I couldn't find anything that told me exactly when it dated to, I'm afraid, but that would figure with when it was an important port. So probably yes, I would say.
Any other questions? Yeah. So we've had Trevor Farnes. Is that? Thank you for an interesting presentation. Look forward to visiting the area as soon as I can. That's great. One from Steve. Very interesting. Thank you for including us, Steve. Always a pleasure. Who else have we got there? Sophie, Harnshawn. Really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much. So yeah, we've had some interesting messages. Hilary, fascinating, Alison. Missed the Norfolk coast. So familiar after living in Norfolk for 15 years. So it's really good to be able to try and do some history on different parts of the UK.